Hello, I'm Dr. Natalie Cruz from Ohio University. I direct the District 12 Science Day in Ohio and the Southeast Ohio Regional Science Fair. We're going to walk through how to fill out the science fair forms to hopefully make the process a little bit smoother. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So on my screen, what you can see is Form 1. Every student has to have this form along with Forms 1A and 1B. We're going to walk through those forms first, and then we'll look at some of the forms that you need in special cases. On Form 1, this is a checklist for the adult sponsor. So this adult sponsor may be the teacher or a parent. Often this is a teacher who's signing off on this, but it may also be a parent. So the student needs to fill in their name. So I filled in my name and their project title. This project title needs to be consistent across all of your forms. The teacher or the parent should have reviewed ISEF's rules and guidelines and reviewed Form 1A. And worked with the student and discussed the risks of the project. No project is totally free from risks, and the forms can't necessarily cover every single risk. And so really it's up to this relationship between adult sponsor and the student to minimize risk and make sure that everyone stays safe. Question 4 then gets into the special cases where you may need more approval or more forms. And so those include work with humans. And remember that work with humans doesn't only mean surveys or questionnaires or behavioral tests with humans. It could also be working with hair or teeth. If it's human tissue, you also need permission to use that. If you're working with humans, vertebrate animals, and one of the things we have to remember is that fish and frogs and salamanders and tadpoles are also vertebrate animals. So it's not just testing on dogs or horses or other livestock. This could also be smaller things that we don't always think about as needing that approval. And then potentially hazardous biological agents. And so this can include tissue, so like blood or skin, other tissues, typically from this could be from different animals. This could be from human as well. Microorganisms. So when we think about microorganisms, we're talking about bacteria, fungi, and viruses. And then our DNA. We need to be aware if any of the projects are dealing with any of those, you're going to need additional approvals and additional forms. And then number 5 gets to the forms that every project needs. So every project has to have this form, Form 1A, the student checklist, which we'll look at in a minute, a research plan and project summary, and there are instructions for that, I'll show you where, and Form 1B, which is the approval form. In addition, if a project is being done at a regulated research institution or an industrial setting, so that could include at an industrial facility like a company, or it could include working at a university, then Form 1C would be required. And if you're continuing from a previous year, then Form 7 would be required. So question number 5 on this Form 1A would get you to which of those forms you need. And so for all projects, you should at least have these top 4 boxes checked and all of those items filled out. Now, in question 4, we said we were working with humans. Then we're going to go down to this section that says humans, and it will tell us what else we need to have. So, so you would need a human participants form, and that's Form 4. And that includes approval from an IRB or an institutional review board that shows that you're being safe and that you're being cautious with your human subjects. There's a sample informed consent form that I'll show you in a minute. And so this is a sample that you can fill out to get consent from your human subjects. And then in some cases, you'll need a qualified scientist. And so if you have a qualified scientist, so this would often be like a professor or a doctor or a professional in the field that you're working in, you would need to fill out. Now, if in question 4, we said we were working with vertebrate animals, so let's say we're doing a project looking at how our dogs respond to something or what fish do, then we would go down to here where it says vertebrate animals. And depending on the project, we may need forms 5A, 5B, and 2. So 5A would be for work at school or at home or in the field. So if you were, gathering fish in a stream or something like that, that would be Form 5A. If you're doing work at a regulated research institution, so if you're working at a university, for example, examining the response of fish to certain stressors, you would need to fill out Form 5B, and all of that approval would have to be in place before you start experimentation. And so that's going to include getting approval from that institution's approval board. And so typically those are the most challenging projects to get through approval, because you have to have approval from the university's approval boards before you get started. And then you would need a qualified scientist form for some of these vertebrate animal projects. You would have to have it if you're doing a vertebrate animal project at a regulated research institution. But if you're doing one at home, there are some cases, and we'll get to that. And if up here in question 4, we said we were working with potentially hazardous biological agents. Let's say maybe we're working with fungus. We'll click microorganisms, and then we'll go down here to the potentially hazardous biological agents section. And this tells us that it requires approval ahead of time, and that we will need this Form 6A, that we're using potentially hazardous biological agents. In some cases, we'll need a qualified scientist. If we're working with animal tissue from either a human or a vertebrate animal, we would also need Form 6B. So if instead we said up here in question 4 that we were working with potentially hazardous biological agents, so let's say we're working with fungi, with microorganisms, we would then have to go down here to this section and say figure out which forms we need to fill out from there. So you would need to fill out Form 6A. If you're working with human or vertebrate animal tissue, like blood, hair, bodily fluids, blood products, things like that, you would need Form 6B. Sometimes you'll need a qualified scientist form, and Form 6A and 6B will tell you when you need that supervision and that form filled out. And then there are some projects that use potentially hazardous biological agents but are considered very low risk, but only need Form 3. And so these include like things that are using manure for composting or microbial fuel cells, other things like that, and that they're listed here. And so in those cases, you would just need Form 3. There are also cases where you may be using hazardous chemicals, activities, or devices. And for those ones, you would need a risk assessment form. So you'd need Form 3. If there are, if it is a truly risky project, then you may also need a qualified scientist form. And so once you get through this kind of checklist of what forms you might need, you would then click that everything is correct and that it's been reviewed and that you'll abide by science fair ethics. Now, one of the important parts of this, so this form has a couple of really important things to remember when you're filling it out. So firstly, make sure you go through and check off the boxes that apply to your project. That then lets, when we review them, it lets us know that you've thought through and that you've filled out all the appropriate forms. And then you need the adult sponsor's printed name and their signature, and then the date of review. Now, this date of review gets a lot of people, gets a lot of these forms rejected. So the date of review needs to be before the start of experimentation. So these dates all must predate the start of experimentation. There are a couple of signatures that come after experimentation, but there are only a few forms that require that. And I'll point that out. And then you need a phone number and an email for that adult sponsor. So we're just going to fill this out. So this will be my teacher, they'll sign it, and we're going to date this on New Year's Eve 2020. And then they'll fill in their phone number and their email. All right, so now we're going to go to Form 1A, and this is the student checklist. So on the student checklist, we're going to, again, fill out all of the information. We need to make sure that these are complete. So I'm going to fill this out with my name If I were in a team, I would also put my team members' names down here in 1B and 1C, or just 1B, depending on how many team members there. I'll be in the 10th grade. My email and my phone number. I'll again fill in my project, my title of my project. I need to make sure it's the same as on Form 1. So I'm actually going to go back to Form 1 and I'm going to copy that text in. Then I put in my school information. So I'm going to be a student at Central High School. We'll put in a phone number for the high school and an address, 1 School Road. And then my adult sponsor's name. So again, on Form 1, I put my teacher as my adult sponsor's name, and so I'll write that in here again. And fill in their phone number. And email address. So now on question 5, it asks us if it needs SRC, IRB, or IACUC pre-approval. And so what this is going to mean is if you're working with humans, vertebrate animals, potentially hazardous biological agents, or potentially hazardous chemicals, then you would click yes. If you're not doing any of those things, you would click no. If you're clicking yes here, then you're going to need a tentative start date, because that start date, all of the review has to predate that start date. So for my projects, I'm going to click no for now, but we're going to look at all those forms and talk about them as well. Is this a continuation or progression from a previous year? I'm going to say no, but if I said yes, then I would have to fill out the continuation form, which is Form 7. And I would also have to attach the previous year's abstract and the research plan or project summary from a previous year. So question 6 here is all about if it's a continuation. Question 7 is pretty important. This is what lets us review the dates and the approvals on every other form. So this is your start date and your end date. So you'll see on Form 1 that my data review here was December 31st. Well, that means that I am approved to start my project after December 31st. Right? So all of my signature dates, all of my approval dates that say that they have to be done before experimentation must be before my actual start date. So in this case, I'm going to start my project on January 2nd of 2021. And I'm going to end my experimentation at the beginning of February. So I'm going to spend a month doing my experimentation. Then it asks me where I'm going to do my experimentation. And so for my project, I'm going to do it in the field because I'm looking at impacts of acid mine drainage on macroinvertebrates. But I could also be doing that work at a research institution, which means that I've got some different forms I need to fill out at school or at home. And then it asks me what my source of data is. And so in my project, it's going to be collected by myself. But in many cases, we use data that comes from other places. And so in some cases, we might have data from the internet. We might have data from previous studies. And in that case, we're going to put a description of that in here. So for my macroinvertebrate data, maybe because I'm doing this project in the winter, I can't actually do it in the field. And so I'm going to be doing my research at home, and I'm going to use data from a website. And so I'm going to use data from watersheddata.com that's going to tell me about macroinvertebrates and acid mine drainage. And that's where I talk about that. So then if there are places that I'm working that aren't my home or aren't school, I need to then put those addresses in. So let's say you're doing some research at a gym, or you're doing some research in the field or at a park. you're going to add that in. Or if you're doing some work at a regulated research institution, you would add that address here as well. So question 11 has you complete a research plan or project summary, and that's supposed to be attached to this form. And an abstract is also needs to be completed for all projects after experimentation. So questions 11 and 12, that research plan, the research plan is supposed to happen prior to approval, and the abstract happens after experimentation. And if you scroll down, you'll see instructions for that research plan and what needs to go into that. The key parts of that are the rationale, so why are you doing it? The research question, hypotheses, and the engineering goals if you're doing an engineering project, and expected outcomes. You also write down your procedures, what the risks are and how you're mitigating them, so your risk and safety, how you're going to analyze your data, and a bibliography showing your sources. There are some additional items if you're doing human participants research, vertebrate animal research, potentially hazardous biological agents research, or research with hazardous chemicals, activities, or devices. All right, so this is Form 1A, and every student must fill this one out. Form 1B is an approval form, and this one, again, we have a lot of signatures that go on this sheet. So this top section is completed by the student and the parent. So we have the student's printed name and a signature, my parents' printed name, so my mom, and signature, and then an acknowledgement date. So this is an approval date, and this has to be prior to experimentation. So we remember that on Form 1A, I put my start of experimentation as the 2nd of January. So these approval signatures on Form 1B have to be before that start date. So maybe we signed off on everything the day before. So then when we scroll down to this section 2, this is for projects that need approval before experimentation. So these are projects that are working with human subjects, that are working with vertebrate animals, that are working with potentially hazardous biological agents, and with hazardous chemicals. Those need approval ahead of time. And if that work is going to be done at home, in the field, or at school, then Section 2A needs to be approved. If it's being done, if the work's being done at a regulated research institution, then 2B gets approved. Now, what we need to pay attention to is that for most of your projects, if they need this approval, it's going to happen prior to experimentation at your school. And so you'll have your approver, which is the head of your scientific review committee or institutional review board, who's actually looking at and approving your projects and making sure they're safe. So sometimes that'll be your teacher. So we'll have that be your teacher again. So my teacher, a signature, and this date of approval, again, must be prior to experimentation. Right, this has to be done before your experiments start. So again, my start date is January 2nd. And so we'll make sure that this was approved before we went on winter break. And so this will be done on the 18th of December, right? We just have to make sure that it's approved before we start the experiment. If you did your work at a regulated research institution like a university and got approval through the university systems, you would fill out Section 2B, and that would have to be done after experimentation. Right? So one of the really important things to look at is all of these dates say whether it needs to be before or after experimentation. This bottom section is really for competition, or needs to be filled out before regional, state, or national fairs. And this is done by the fair. So you don't fill this part out. All right, we're going to look at Form 1C. And so most students aren't going to fill this one out. This is if you're working at a regulated research institution or an industrial setting. So this is primarily if you're working at a university. And so you would again fill in the student's name and the title of the project at the top. And then there would be this is then completed by whoever's supervising you at that institution. So if there's a professor who's working with you, they would fill this out. So, so they talk about, you know, are you providing guidance or mentorship to the student? And then if they did, then they would fill out the rest of the form. So, you know, is this part of your ongoing research or work? And then you talk about essentially, you know, what that university person or the research institution person did to help with the project. So it talks about how you were an independent researcher. So again, this is your supervisor is filling this out. And this one, if you need this form, this has to be signed and dated after experimentation. So this is looking back at what you did to talk about how you worked as a group and how you worked independently, to show that your project was independent work, so that you get appropriate credit for. All right, so Form 2 now is used for research that has potential risks that are associated with human subjects research, vertebrate animal research, potentially hazardous biological agents, and hazardous substances and devices research. And this one has to be completed and signed before the start of student experimentation. So what that means is that you need, again, your name and your title. The qualified scientist will then fill out the rest of this with their name, their educational background and degrees, and their experience or training. So in terms of like their position. So if I were supervising a student, you know, my background is in environmental science. So if I was supervising a student, I would fill out that information to show that I'm qualified to supervise a project in that. You then, that supervisor then fills out the rest of this form about their supervision of the student. And the qualified scientist would then fill out and sign this before the start of the project. So again, this date needs to be before the start of experimentation. So in this case, we'll have this approved on the 1st of January when our start date is the 2nd of January. Now, if the qualified scientist isn't the one who's actively supporting, so for example, if the qualified scientist is just letting you borrow some equipment, then your designated supervisor, which will be, you know, a responsible adult, would fill this out, would fill and sign out the second section. It's usually the preference for it to be the qualified. We're going to move on to Form 3, the risk assessment form. So risk assessment form is going to be completed when a student's working with hazardous chemicals or devices, or with potentially hazardous biological agents. So again, you need a consistent student name and title, and then working with a designated supervisor or qualified scientist, the student will work through each of the questions on the form and have it signed off. That date of review, this date here, needs to again be prior to the start, so before the start date listed on Form 1A. So your start dates are all based on Form 1A, and these approval dates need to be done primarily before that start date. The human participants form, Form 4, that I'm showing here, this one is for students that are working with human subjects. So if you're going to be doing a survey or a test, or seeing how fast your friends run, or how well you can concentrate, or if you're working with human tissue, so like hair or teeth, things like that. I think I said that before. You would need to fill out this form. So again, you fill out your student name and title of the project and your adult sponsor. So we'll fill this out. My project here is going to be looking at people's eye color and concentration. My adult sponsor is my teacher, and we'll fill in their phone number and email. So this top part is then going to be completed with your adult sponsor, or if you're working with a designated supervisor or qualified scientist with them. And so this is going to confirm that you have a research plan that addresses all of the human participants section of the instructions that are on Form 1A, and that you've attached surveys or questionnaires that you're going to use, and that you've attached the informed consent form that you're going to use if the IRB, which is the Institutional Review Board that reviews your use of human subjects, that you're going to attach the informed consent form. And I'll show you in a second a sample informed consent form that you can use if this is your situation. And then you'll check whether you're working with a qualified scientist or not. If you're working with a qualified scientist, you're going to need to attach Form 2, and we already went through that one. Then the school typically, or sometimes the regional fair, will run an IRB. That IRB is going to necessarily be made up of 3 members, a medical or mental health professional. Oftentimes this will be your school nurse, an educator, and the school administrator. So often this will be your school nurse, teacher, and the principal. And they'll go through this this checklist, reviewing your research plan to see whether what you're doing is safe and protective of your human subjects. So top box would be checked if it's approved, and then it would need to be signed and dated by each of those people. And the dates must be before that start date on Form 1A. Very, very important. It says must be prior to experimentation here, that date is before the start date. And then that review board is going to decide whether the project has minimal risk or more than minimal risk, whether they're going to require a qualified scientist. So if you're doing something that's a little risky, like if you're looking at maximum heart rate due to exercise, you might need a qualified scientist, like a doctor, to be working with you, particularly if there are any risk factors, or a designated supervisor. So a qualified scientist is going to be somebody who by practice and by profession is qualified to supervise a more risky project, whereas a designated supervisor could be a parent or somebody else who is who's being responsible for minimizing risk in the project. And so if it's a little riskier, then you may need to, then the IRB may decide that you need as a designated supervisor or a qualified scientist. If you have a qualified scientist, you need to fill out Form 2. If you have a designated supervisor, you need to fill out Form 3. And then the IRB will determine whether written permission, so an informed consent form, is required for minor participants, whether written parental permission is required for minor participants, and whether written informed consent is required for adult participants. And so there are a few different categories of yes, no, or not applicable, depending on who the subjects are in the study. And then all 3 of those members have to sign and date, again, prior to, before the start of experimentation, and that start of experimentation is listed on Form 1A. So this is a sample informed consent form that can be used if that's needed for your study. And there are instructions, instruction up top. You then fill out all of the details on here and let your participants then sign off on this form to say that they are consenting to participating in your study. So you'd fill in your name, the title of your project, and then you need to show them what the purpose of your project is, what they're going to be asked to do, how long that's going to take, if there are any risks to them, what the benefits of the study are, and how you're going to maintain confidentiality. And then you need the adult sponsor or qualified scientists or designated supervisors, name and phone and email in case any of the participants have questions about the study. And then at the bottom, this is where the adult or minor would sign consent and where you would get parental consent for minor participants. And again, these have to be signed before they participate. So this needs to happen again before participation. This form, the top part of this form, should be filled out for the IRB to review to make sure that you're giving all of the appropriate details to the IRB for approval. So those are the forms that are needed for human subjects. We're going to move on to vertebrate animals. So Form 5A is for use of vertebrate animals at school, at home, or a field research site. And this is going to require SRC approval, which is a safety review committee, to ensure that you are following safety rules essentially, and that you're using vertebrate animals appropriately. Part of why we do this is really to make sure that we're being ethical and using vertebrate animals in experimentation safely and appropriately. So again, student name and title of the project. And then these are all the details that you as a student researcher will fill out. So what type of animal are you using? Are you doing experimentation on pygmy goats, or are you using fish? And what kind of fish? And then how many animals you're using. You would then fully describe how those animals are being kept and how they're being cared for. So, are they your household dog that you're doing experiments on, and therefore how are you keeping that, versus do you have a tank of fish that are being fed daily and that you're cleaning their tank, every 2 weeks? How is that happening, and how often are you checking on that animal or observing that animal? The box that they give you on this form is really small, so you may have to add an additional sheet to make sure that you answer all of these questions. Then importantly, you need to answer what's happening to the animals after experimentation. So we don't want to be in a situation where you're doing an experiment on 100 fish, and then you're going to just flush those fish down the toilet at the end of your experiment. That would not be a particularly ethical way of doing that. And so we need to think about what's going to happen to those animals when you're done. If there are any wildlife licenses or approvals that are needed, that needs to be attached to this form as well. And so sometimes when we're doing field research that involves things like collecting fish in a stream, you would need approval from wildlife agencies to do that. And so it also suggests that if there are any issues with that animal that during experimentation, that the rules require that a vet investigate that. So keep that in mind as well. So before experimentation, the SRC, the Scientific Review Committee, needs to look at all of these details and decide whether you need a designated supervisor, whether you need a vet and a designated supervisor, or whether you need a vet, a designated supervisor, and a qualified scientist, right? So that is going to be based on what you're doing, what the risks are to the and what the risks are to the animal. So that would then be signed off by your SRC chair, which often will be your teacher who's running your science fair, and then a date of approval, which again must be before the start date that's listed on Form 1A. If a vet is necessary, then this left bottom box will need to be filled out and signed again before experimentation. And if a designated supervisor or qualified scientist is appropriate, then the right-hand box would be filled out and signed and dated prior to experimentation. If for some reason you're working with vertebrate animals in a regulated research institution, the regulated research institution, like a university, is going to have its own process for approving use of vertebrate animals, and that's called IACUC. And that approval would have to be in place before experimentation. For some university researchers, they have that protocol already set up and would just need to add the student researcher to that after the student researcher completes training. But whatever's happening at a regulated research institution needs to be approved by that regulated research institution. And so again, you would fill out the same details, but you would have to show that you have approval from that institution to do your project. So you would need the protocol number of the IACUC approved project. And then you're going to go through those same project details. So what's the species of animal and how many of them, what's the student role in the project, and what how oversight and safety was ensured. And then was there weight loss or death in any of the animals? And if so, how was that investigated? And then if the student's project also involves use of tissues, so like blood or other muscles, other cells, then forms 6A and 6B would also be required. And then you also have to report what training you were given, and attach a copy of that institution's approval of the project, and that all has to be signed off on again. This form, because everything gets approved before experimentation by the institution, this form is actually filled out and signed after experimentation. It's one of the exceptions to that rule that things need to be done before experimentation. And it's only done after experimentation because the institution has already approved that work through their process. So we're going to look at Form 6A and 6B, which are for potentially hazardous biological agents. So for 6A, this is a risk assessment form for use of potentially hazardous biological agents. So this is for anything involving microorganisms, rDNA, fresh or frozen tissue. So this could be cell lines, this could be tissue culture, for blood products, bodily fluids. And this is going to require approval prior to experimentation by the SRC. So this again is just going to be a process of really walking through all the details of that work. So your name and the title of the project, and then in collaboration with your qualified scientist or designated supervisor, you would fill out the rest of these details. So section 1 is a project assessment. So this is about, really about what are you using, and how safe is that? Where are you using it? What sort of containment is there? How will you minimize risk? And given that risk assessment, so what are you using? Where are you using it? How are you minimizing risk? What biosafety level do you think this project gains? And you'll do this in cooperation with a scientist. So this isn't an assessment all on the student. And then how are you going to dispose of those biologic agents? And so all of that goes into that safety. And then there's a section on what training the student would receive to be able to be safe. And then based on that, the qualified scientist or designated supervisor will fill out these bottom boxes and sign off on them. This has to be signed off on before experimentation to show that you have thought through all of the safety parameters before you get started. 6B is required if you're using human or vertebrate animal tissue. And so this could be cell lines, tissue culture, blood products, and bodily fluids. You also have to complete Form 6A in this case. And so again, you start out with your name and the title of your project, and then what type of tissue are you using? Where is it coming from? And then if it's coming from a vertebrate animal study that's being done at a research institution, then you would need that IACUC certification along with all the details associated with it. And then this bottom section would be completed by your qualified scientist or designated supervisor if you're working with tissue, and they would sign off on all of that. And again, this needs to be approved before experimentation. All right, we're down to our last one. So Form 7 is a continuation of research. So if you're continuing or expanding upon your project from a previous year, then you're going to firstly include the previous year's abstract and research plan. And then you're going to basically fill out these 2 columns to say, when was your previous research, and to contrast the two projects. So you'll have the previous title and your current title, how you've changed your goal or purpose or objective, how you change your methodology, on what variables you studied in each of them, and if there are any additional changes between the 2 projects. And then you'll check the box saying that you've included your abstract and research plan and project summary from the previous year and sign. So again, this one is one of those exceptions to the everything must be signed before experimentation. This is something you do after experimentation, so that you can really compare and contrast and talk clearly about the differences between your two projects. So what this one is supposed to show is a progression, and that your new project is truly new, is an expansion from the former one. Right, so this was a reasonably detailed explanation of all of the ISEF forms that are required for your project. Keep in mind that most projects do not require this many forms. And so really use that form 1, I'm just going to flip back to it, this form 1 to determine which of these forms you need. 1A, and 1B are required for all students. And then depending on what you're doing, you may need additional forms. I hope this has been helpful. I hope that your science fair season is successful, and thank you so much for listening.